If you grew up in Canada, there was a Westclox on your nightstand, a Big Ben, round-faced, with two little feet and a bell on its back, and a ring hard enough to haul you out of bed on a January morning. For 60 years, it was simply what an alarm clock was. Behind that clock stood a factory on a hill in Peterborough, Ontario, that at its wartime peak put 800 people to work and shipped clocks by the hundreds of thousands. It survived the Depression, survived a world war by making munitions, survived the electric clock, the clock radio, and 30 years of cheaper imitations. And then, after more than 60 years of making time on that hill, the last clock came off the line. How does a company that woke a whole country simply go quiet? What happened up there? Chapter 1. The Clock on the Nightstand. For most of the 20th century, there was a good chance that the last thing you saw before you turned off the light, and the first thing you heard in the morning, was made on a hill on the east side of Peterborough, Ontario. It sat on the nightstand. It had a round face, two little feet, and a bell on its back, and when it went off, it didn't beep or chirp or play a tune. It rang. A hard, insistent, metal-on-metal ring that could pull a farmhand out of bed in the dark of a January morning and put a shift on the factory floor by 7. It was called the Big Ben. Its smaller cousin was the Baby Ben. And for 3 generations, in kitchens and bedrooms from Victoria to St. John's, they were simply what an alarm clock was. Here is the thing most people never knew about that clock. The most Canadian object in the house, the one that woke the country up, was American from the first bolt. The company that made it didn't begin in Ontario. It began in a small river town in Illinois, in the workshop of a German-born clockmaker named Charles Stahlberg, who in 1885 was trying to build an alarm clock cheap enough for a working man to own. His United Clock Company failed, twice. It was pulled out of the wreckage by an industrialist named F.W. Matheson, who moved the works to the town of LaSalle and set it down beside his zinc smelter, because Matheson understood something about scale that the clockmaker never had. The name they eventually stamped on the product was a contraction, plain as a tool: Westclox, Western Clock Company. And in 1920, that American company crossed the border and started assembling clocks on a Canadian hillside. You have probably heard how this story ends. A great factory, a fatal blunder, a company too proud, or too slow, or too stubborn to see the future coming. And then the lights go out, and the machines fall silent, and all that's left is a ruin. It's a satisfying shape for a story. One mistake, one villain, one clean line from the top of the hill to the bottom. Keep that version in mind, because we're going to hold it up to the light and turn it over and see whether it survives. The truth is stranger and sadder, and it starts with a question nobody in Peterborough was asking in 1920, because in 1920, the future looked like nothing but more clocks. How does a factory that spent 60 years making time, that woke a whole country morning after morning, decade after decade, how does a place like that run out of it? To answer that, you have to climb the hill. Chapter 2. The Electric City Buys an American Clock. The hill was in Peterborough because Peterborough, in those years, was the kind of town that got things. They called it the Electric City. It had earned the name honestly. In the 80s, it became one of the first towns in Canada to light its streets with electricity, drawing power off the Otonabee River that ran through the middle of it. Cheap hydroelectricity, a rail line that put the town roughly halfway between Montreal and Toronto, and a municipal council that wasn't shy about offering a bonus to a manufacturer who'd bring jobs. All of it made Peterborough a magnet for industry at the exact moment industry was looking for somewhere to land. And it had landed. Canadian General Electric had been in Peterborough since 1892, the Edison Company's Canadian arm, a sprawling operation that at its peak would employ something close to 6,000 people. Quaker Oats was there. So was the outboard motor business that grew out of the old Peterborough canoe trade, and the dairy equipment maker de Laval. This was a town that made things and knew it. So when the Western Clock Company went looking, in 1919, for a place to build clocks inside Canada, Peterborough was an obvious choice. But why build inside Canada at all? Why would an Illinois company go to the trouble, Because of a wall. Not a wall you could see, but one every manufacturer of the era could feel. The tariff. Under Canada's national policy, and later under the system of imperial preference that tied the country's trade to Britain and the Empire, goods manufactured outside Canada were taxed at the border. An American clock shipped whole into Toronto arrived carrying a penalty. But an American company that set up a factory on Canadian soil and assembled its clocks there could jump clean over the wall, sell to the protected Canadian market, and ship out to the rest of the empire besides. This was the branch plant bargain, and it built a great deal of industrial Canada. A head office somewhere else, a factory here, the decisions made there, the work done here. Westclox had been selling into Canada for years already. Big Ben's had been on Canadian shelves since around 1910. Though a Canadian buyer paid $3 for the clock, an American could buy for $2.50, the difference being, more or less, the wall. In 1912, the company opened a Canadian sales office in Toronto. In 1919, it incorporated a subsidiary, the Western Clock Company, Limited, and in January of 1920, in rented space in Peterborough, 20 workers began putting together clocks from parts shipped up from LaSalle. 20 people. It's worth holding that number a moment against everything that came after. They weren't making the parts yet. Those still came from Illinois. They were assembling them, fitting the pieces, testing the movements, boxing the finished clocks. And they were fast. By the middle of 1921, that little operation was turning out something like 10,000 4-inch clocks a month. The rented space couldn't hold it. So in 1922, the company bought 15 acres on the east side of the river, in the old village of Ashburnham, the part of town people called East City, high on Armour Hill, with the ground falling away toward the Trent Canal below. They chose the hilltop on purpose. Down in the valley, the traffic and the trains threw up dirt and vibration. And dirt and vibration are the enemies of anyone trying to assemble a mechanism the size of a coat button. Up on the hill, the air was cleaner, and the ground was still. And there was a man on his way to build it. His name was J.H. Werner, and he was, by any measure, the most important person this story will meet. He'd trained for medicine and given it up for clocks. He'd run Westclox's export business across Europe. And in 1922, he came back across the Atlantic for one reason: to raise a factory on a hill in Ontario, and then to run it. He would run it for 31 years. Chapter 3. Mr. Westclox. They finished the building at the end of December, 1922, and it was, for its moment, a beautiful thing to work in. 4 stories of brick and artificial stone, the main block running 160 feet along the crest of the hill. The whole set on landscaped grounds that looked down over the canal. It didn't look like a factory so much as an institution, a bank, or a college. And that was the point. Werner wanted a model plant, and he got one. By 1923, it was fully running, with around 180 people on the payroll, and it did everything under one roof: design, engineering, accounting, and the delicate, patient work of assembly. Werner believed in that building the way some men believe in a church. He had married, by most accounts, into the Mathieson family itself, the same Mathieson who'd saved the company back in Illinois. And he ran Peterborough not as a hired manager, but as something closer to a squire. He knew workers by name. He hired their children. He walked the floor. And he built, brick by brick and year by year, a way of doing things that people would still be describing, with a catch in the throat, half a century later. They had a name for him that he was happy to encourage. They called him Mr. Westclox. Under Werner, the plant simply kept growing. There's an easy way to measure it: the additions. They built onto the factory in 1927, again in the middle of the 1930s, again in 1941, 1949, 1950, 1952, 6 expansions in 25 years, the building spreading along the hill like something alive. The payroll grew with it, 180 in the 20s, up to about 400 by the end of the 30s, which is a small miracle when you think about when the end of the 30s was. Because the thing that should have killed a company selling small luxuries to ordinary families was the Depression, and the Depression didn't kill Westclox. A cheap, reliable alarm clock, it turned out, was one of the last things a household gave up. When you've lost almost everything, you still have to be at work on time, assuming there's work. And a $2 clock that never asked for anything was exactly the kind of small, durable dignity that people held on to. The plant that might have closed instead added a wing. Then came the war, and the war was the making of the place. On the last day of July, 1942, across the whole Westclox enterprise, ordinary clock production stopped. The country needed something else from a company full of people who could machine tiny metal parts to impossible tolerances, and what it needed was munitions. The Peterborough plant turned to war work, precision instruments, compasses, and above all fuses, the intricate timing and detonating mechanisms that go into artillery shells. It is a strange, dark irony that a factory built to wake people gently in the morning spent the war making the mechanisms that go off at the other end of a gun. But the work was precise, and Westclox people were precise, and the combination of clockwork and munitions work turned out to be enormously profitable. It also pushed the plant to its highest employment it would ever reach. At the wartime peak, around 800 people worked on that hill. 800. Remember that number. Not because it's large, by the standards of Canadian General Electric down in the valley it was modest, but because, years from now, when the story of this factory gets told and retold, people are going to reach for a bigger number. They're going to borrow one. And it won't be true. Peterborough's peak was 800, and it earned every one of them. When the war ended, the munitions work fell away. One manager later reckoned it dwindled to something like a tenth of the plant's output through the 50s and 60s, and Westclox went back to what it was born to do. But it went back changed, bigger, prouder, more sure of itself, and more than ever the beating heart of a neighborhood on a hill. The clock started rolling out again by the hundreds of thousands, and the town settled back into the rhythm the factory kept. Chapter 4. The Women Who Built Time. Walk up Armour Hill on a weekday morning in 1950, and you'd have been walking against a tide. They came on foot, mostly, up from the houses of East City, a stream of people converging on the gates before the shift, breath showing white in the cold, because a Peterborough winter does not negotiate. The walk up the hill was steep enough to warm you, and the building at the top was warm in a way that mattered. Inside, the temperature stayed even and mild all year, because the mechanisms demanded it. A clock movement assembled at one temperature and run at another will keep bad time. So the people who built time worked in a kind of permanent, careful spring, while outside the canal froze and the snow piled against the north wall. And most of those people were women. Roughly 6 in every 10 workers on that floor were women. More than that during the war. And this was not incidental. It was the whole design. The work of a clock factory, the part that couldn't be done by a stamping press or a lathe, was assembly, fitting the wheels and pinions and springs of a movement, by hand, under a lamp, hour after hour. It rewarded small fingers, steady nerves, and a tolerance for the kind of repetition that would drive most people out of their minds by lunch. Managers of the era believed, with total conviction, that this was women's work, and they built a workforce around that belief. What that meant, day to day, we know better than we might, because decades later, a historian named Joan Sangster went looking for these women, the ones still living, and sat with them and recorded what they remembered. Through her work, you can still hear the floor. One woman described the assembly benches, the trays of parts, the particular satisfaction of a movement that came together, clean and ticked to life in your hands the first time. Another remembered the noise, not the roar of heavy industry, but a lighter, denser sound, the massed ticking and testing of thousands of clocks, a sound like a field of insects running under everything all day. There was pride in it, and the pride was real. A woman on that floor could look at the finished Big Ben going into its box and know she'd built the thing that would sit on a stranger's nightstand in Moose Jaw or Trois-Rivières and wake them for 20 years. The clocks were stamped, in those years, made by Western Clock Co., Limited, Peterborough, Canada. The earliest Canadian Big Ben movement anyone's found carries a date late in December of 1923, and later, simply Westclox Canada. That stamp was a small immortality. You couldn't sign your work, but the town's name went out on everyone. The Peterborough these women came from was, in Sangster's plain description, a small and ethnically homogeneous Ontario city. This is worth being honest about, because the great Canadian factory story of the century is so often a story of immigration. The Italian and Portuguese and Ukrainian and Polish workers who filled the floors of Hamilton and Windsor and Montreal, learning English or French over the lunch pail. Westclox on its hill was a quieter, more local thing. The workforce came, in the main, from the streets below the plant and the farms around the town. English-speaking, long settled, tied together by family and church, and the simple fact that everyone's cousin worked there too. It gave the place a particular closeness. It also, though no one could have known it then, gave the place a particular fragility. A factory woven that tightly into one small town has that much more to lose when it goes. But nobody on that floor in 1950 was thinking about loss. They were thinking about the trays in front of them, and the whistle at the end of the shift, and the walk back down the hill in the early dark. And they were thinking, some of them, about the softball season. Chapter 5. The Quarter Century Club. Because Westclox was not just a place people worked, it was, in the word everyone who was there reaches for, a family. And Werner built it that way on purpose. There was a quarter-century club for the workers who'd given the company 25 years, and the remarkable thing is how many qualified. At one company dinner, a manager stood up and claimed that 40% of the people employed back in 1931 were still with the company a quarter of a century later. 40%. In an age we now think of as one of restless labor, nearly half the floor had stayed a lifetime. There were benefits and outings and a company magazine, and above all, there were the teams, because Werner understood that a factory that plays together stays together. The Westclox women's softball team was not a token. In 1945, they won the provincial championship. Sangster gave her study of all this a wry title. She called it the softball solution, the idea that the warmth was also, quietly, a strategy, that loyalty and outings and championship softball were the things that kept wages patient and unions distant, and the whole enterprise humming along as one big contented household, with Mr. Westclox at the head of the table. That's true. It was a strategy. But the people who lived inside it will tell you, without contradiction, that it was also real. Both things at once. That's usually how it is with a good place to work. And the clocks it made had by now spread into every corner of Canadian life. The Big Ben and the Baby Ben were the staples, but Peterborough made things you couldn't get from the American parent. Clocks aimed squarely at the Canadian market, and some of them, at Canadian children. There was the Pixie in the 1930s. There was the Early Bird after the war. There was Woody's Cafe in the late 50s, with the Woody Woodpecker face. The plant even built clocks under the Seth Thomas name, another old mark folded into the same corporate family. Whatever kind of clock a Canadian household wanted, there was a fair chance it came off that hill. The factory kept the neighborhood's time too, and not only in the poetic sense. People in East City used to say you could set your watch by the Westclox whistle. Whether that was literally true, or just the kind of thing people said about the place that made the clocks, hardly mattered. The shifts moved to it. The streets filled and emptied to it. For the families down the hill, the working day had a shape, and the factory drew the shape. It could have gone on like that forever. It felt, to the people living it, like it would. The first sign that it wouldn't came in 1952, and it didn't look like a threat at all. It looked like progress. That year, the workers voted in a union, the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers, the same union that represented the big plant down in the valley. By any modern measure, it was overdue. Westclox had gone 30 years without one, held together by Werner's paternalism and the softball solution. But to the man who'd built the family, it landed as something else. In the memory of the people who were there, the union broke Werner's heart. Because to him, a union meant his family had asked, formally and in writing, for protection from him. The next year, in 1953, Mr. Westclox retired. He left at the top. The plant was full. The order books were full. The clocks were going out by the hundreds of thousands. And the name on the hill meant something in every house in the country. Werner got out while it was still, unmistakably, his. He was lucky in his timing, though he'd have hated the reason why. Chapter 6. 40 million Big Bens. The 1950s were the summit. If you wanted to freeze this story at its highest point, the moment before the ground begins, ever so slightly, to tilt, you would freeze it here, in the confidence of the middle of that decade. The numbers the enterprise was throwing off were staggering. In 1956, Westclox announced that it had built, across its whole history, more than 40 million Big Bens and 28 million Baby Bens. 40 million of a single clock. Down at the American parent plant in Illinois, the big brother that had sent those first parts north in 1920, something like 4,000 workers were turning out as many as 40,000 timepieces in a single day. Peterborough was the smaller northern arm of all that, 800 at its most, a branch on a very large tree. But it was a proud branch, and it shared in the family's triumph. And on that hill in Ontario, the future looked like nothing but more of the same. The company believed it too. In 1959, Westclox built its 53 millionth Big Ben, and the milestone was noticed all the way down in Washington, where it drew a formal commendation on the floor of the United States House of Representatives. A clock, commended by a national legislature. That is what dominance looks like. When the thing you make is woven so deep into ordinary life that a government pauses to salute the count. And here is where the story turns its face, just slightly, toward the dark. Because in that very same year, 1959, the American business magazine Forbes ran an article about the clock industry, and it carried a title that would look, in hindsight, like a headstone. It was called What the Clock Watchers Didn't See. Underneath the celebration, the commendations, the 40 millions, sales of the mechanical household clock were already beginning to sag. The market that had absorbed everything Westclox could make for 40 years was, quietly, starting to have enough. The company was not blind to change. It was pouring money and talent into the timing devices of a new age, the mechanisms inside missiles, the clocks inside early computers, the precise and profitable machinery of the Cold War. But its bread and butter, the thing its name was built on, was the wind-up alarm clock, the one you set by turning a key on its back, the one that needed no battery because it needed no electricity at all, only a human hand and a little faith. And somewhere else in the world, not on that hill, not in that country, not yet with a date on it, engineers were building the thing that would make the wind-up clock obsolete. It wasn't ready. It wasn't cheap. In the 50s, it was barely more than a promise in a laboratory. The people walking up Armour Hill to build the 53 millionth Big Ben had never heard of it, and wouldn't have believed you if you'd tried to explain. They were standing at the very top of the hill. The view from up there was tremendous, and not one of them could see that the ground had already, silently, begun to slope away beneath their feet. Chapter 7. A Crystal in Japan. On Christmas Day, 1969, in a shop in Tokyo, a company called Kei Hattori put 100 wristwatches on sale and quietly ended a way of measuring time that had lasted for centuries. The watch was called the Seiko Quartz Astron. It cost $1,250, the price of a small car. And it was cased in 18-karat gold. And inside it, in place of the springs and gears that had driven every fine timepiece since the 17th century, there was a sliver of quartz crystal vibrating under a tiny current. It kept time to within 5 seconds a month. Within a week, all 100 were sold. It would take years for the price to fall and the technology to spread. But the direction was set. By 1978, quartz had overtaken the mechanical movement for good. Up on the hill in Peterborough, they were still winding springs. What happened next to the world's clockmakers has a name. And if you know anything about fine watches, you already know it: the quartz crisis. It fell hardest on the Swiss, who had owned the top of the market for 200 years and were suddenly making beautiful, intricate, obsolete machines. The number of Swiss watch companies collapsed from more than 1,600 at the start of the 1970s to fewer than 600 a decade or so later. The number of people employed in the Swiss industry fell from 90,000 to a fraction of that. It gutted the American watch industry too. The great old names, Hamilton and Elgin and Waltham, went down almost together. Only a couple survived in any recognizable form. This is the version of the Westclox story that everyone tells. The clever little crystal from Japan arrives, and the proud old company on the hill is too slow, too stubborn, too in love with the wind-up clock to change. And so it dies, the way the dinosaurs died, killed by something small and cold it never saw coming. It is a good story. It is also wrong in one crucial detail, because Westclox saw it coming. The company Westclox belonged to, by now a corporation called General Time, was not some sleepy relic caught flat-footed by the future. General Time had a research operation in Dumbarton, in Scotland, that had helped develop quartz timekeeping for the Apollo space program. Read that again. The same corporate family that made the Big Ben helped put accurate time on the missions to the moon. Westclox built its first quartz movement in 1972. In 1974, it put a quartz clock on the market and called it, of all things, the Big Ben solid state. They knew. They had the technology in their own hands. So if this isn't a story about a company that couldn't see the future, what is it a story about? It's a story about a building. A 4-story brick building from 1922, laid out for people at benches fitting parts by hand, standing on a hill in a country whose whole industrial logic was about to be turned inside out. You cannot easily turn a plant like that into a modern, automated electronics line. And even if you could, why would you do it here, in a high-wage Canadian town, behind a tariff wall that was starting to come down, when the same corporation could stamp out quartz movements far more cheaply somewhere else entirely? That was the real question hanging over the hill in the 1970s. Not, can we build quartz clocks? They could. The question was, will anyone choose to build them here? And the people who would answer that question did not work in Peterborough. They never had. The historian Joan Sangster, who recorded all this, set the causes down plainly, and it's worth letting her list stand, because it names the machine that killed the plant. Competition from abroad. Lower wages elsewhere in the Westclox empire. Falling tariffs. The failure to move the Canadian plant into the new technology. And, at the end, the takeover by a distant conglomerate with 100 other concerns. 5 forces. Not one. And not a single one of them was an act of local pride. The first crack had shown years before anyone was talking about crystals. Back in August of 1966, the Peterborough Examiner had run a small, easy-to-miss item. Westclox was selling one of its factory sites. A buyer was planning to convert the building. 20 years before the end, the company was already, quietly, letting go of the ground beneath it. The people on the hill didn't read it as an ending. Why would they? The clocks were still going out, but the decisions that mattered were already being made in a boardroom far to the south, and they were about to be made by strangers. Chapter 8. Decisions made elsewhere. The man who took control of the Big Ben had almost certainly never wound one in his life. His name was Franz Tally, and he ran an Arizona conglomerate called Tally Industries, a company whose business was defense and aerospace, and the chemistry of things that inflate very quickly, like the airbags that were beginning to go into cars. In 1968, Tally made a bid for General Time. It was not welcome. The board of the clock company fought him, took out advertisements, urged its own shareholders to vote the raider down, did everything a besieged board does, and it lost. In January of 1970, after a long proxy battle, the takeover was complete. Think about what that meant on the hill in Peterborough, though nobody on the hill was told to think about it. The company that made the gentle bedside clock that woke Canada in the morning was now a small line item inside a defense contractor 2,000 miles away. Its capital, the money that might have retooled the plant for quartz, now had to compete, every budget cycle, against missiles and aerospace and airbags. A 4-story clock factory in Ontario was never going to win that argument. This is the heart of it, and it's worth being careful and fair about, because the easy word here is arrogance, and the easy word is wrong. Nobody at headquarters looked at Peterborough and thought, "We are too proud to change." What they thought was arithmetic. Retooling an old, high-wage, tariff-protected branch plant to make quartz clocks that could compete with movements pouring out of Asia at a fraction of the cost. The numbers simply never worked. It wasn't stubbornness. It was a spreadsheet. And a spreadsheet is a colder thing to be killed by than pride, because pride at least means someone cared enough to be foolish. They did try to find another way. In December of 1968, General Times' Canadian arm announced a 4-year expansion, including a brand new plant, 75,000 square feet, down in the industrial park at Amherst, Nova Scotia. A man named Frank Harvey was named to manage it. It was meant to be a fresh start, in a region hungry for work, away from the aging building on the hill. And a year later, in December of 1969, the head of the Canadian company, very likely a man named R.L. Shaw, stood in front of the Peterborough employees and said a thing that should have frozen the blood of everyone in the room, if only they'd known how to hear it. He told them the company had to develop new business. We must develop new business. It sounds like ambition. It was a confession. You only say that out loud to a clock factory when you already suspect the clocks aren't going to be enough. What became of the Amherst plant, the record barely says. It was announced, a manager was named, and then the paper trail thins to nothing. Whether it opened, whether it struggled, whether it quietly closed, that story seems to have slipped through the floorboards of history. But the plea that came with it survives, and the plea is the point. By the end of the 1960s, the people running Westclox in Canada already knew the ground was moving. Then the American parent began to fold in on itself. In 1979, General Time moved its headquarters south to Norcross, Georgia. A little further from the hill, one more layer of distance between the people who decided and the people who made. And the following spring, the decision that everyone in the whole enterprise must have dreaded finally came down. On the 31st of March, 1980, the original Westclox plant, the great works at LaSalle, Peru, Illinois, where Matheson had set the company beside his smelter, where the parts for those first 20 Peterborough workers had been made, shut its doors. The big brother was gone. And on the hill in Peterborough, everyone understood, without needing to be told, what that meant for the smaller, more distant, more expendable Canadian arm. When the parent plant closes, the branch plant does not have long. That is the branch plant bargain, collected at last. The jobs had come from somewhere else. Now the decision to end them would come from somewhere else too. From Illinois, then from Georgia, then from Arizona. Never once from Peterborough. The town had spent 60 years building the empire's clocks. It had never, for one single day, held the key that wound the empire's fate. And now, the empire was running down. Chapter 9. Running Down. The end, when it came, did not come with a whistle. There was no last shift with a banner, no final clock signed by the workers and passed hand to hand. Peterborough did not get the mercy of a clean ending, the kind of ending that gives a town a date to grieve. Instead, the manufacturing just wore away. Through the early 1980s, the work thinned, the shifts shortened, the number of people on the hill fell. Somewhere in the middle of that decade, most likely 1986, though even the records can't quite agree, the last clock made in Peterborough came off the line. Nobody is entirely sure which one it was. Nobody is entirely sure how many people were still there to make it. Those numbers exist. They almost certainly still exist. In 15 or so cardboard boxes in the Peterborough Museum and Archives, in seniority lists and payroll sheets, the names of the men and women who were there at the end, waiting in the dark of an archive for someone to open the lid. But they never made it into the wider world. The plant that had been so proud, that had commanded a salute from a national legislature for its 53 millionth clock, ended so quietly that its own hometown lost the exact count. A small facility hung on for a while as a Canadian office, a place clocks were shipped through rather than made, but the making was done. 66 years after 20 people first fitted American parts in a rented Peterborough room, there was no longer a clock factory on the hill. The people scattered the way people do. Many of them were women who'd given the place their whole working lives. the quarter-century club made flesh, and who now, in their 50s and 60s, carried a skill the world had stopped needing: the patient hand assembly of a mechanism nobody built by hand anymore. Years later, some of them found each other again. In 2009, and again in July of 2018, the former Westclox workers held reunions, sitting together in a room, all those hands that had built all those clocks, remembering. One of them, a retired clockmaker named Mary Kearns, put it about as simply as it can be put. It was good, she said, to bring up the stories you'd forgotten, and to feel good about old times gone by. Another, Patsy Haggerty, who helped organize the gatherings, remembered a job that tells you everything about what it was like to work inside a place that made time. Part of her work had been to test the electric clocks, to sound them one after another, and listen. You'd hold the clock up, you'd listen to it run, and you'd hang it back up and reach for the next one. Imagine a working life measured out like that. One clock at a time. Listen and hang it back up. Listen and hang it back up. For years. And then one day, the room where you did it was empty, and the ticking that had run under the whole hill like a heartbeat had stopped. That's how it ended. Not in a catastrophe. In a silence that arrived so gradually that the town couldn't say exactly when the last of the sound went out of the building. Chapter 10. The Fire That Wasn't Ours. Here is where the story is supposed to end in flames. Because if you go looking for the death of Westclox, you will find a fire, a spectacular one. On New Year's Day, 2012, a landmark Westclox factory complex went up in an enormous arson blaze, a sprawling site, dozens of buildings, close to 800,000 square feet, empty for decades, and lit up against the winter sky while dozens of fire departments fought to contain it. 2 teenagers had broken in and poured gasoline. One of them, a 17-year-old named Stephen Gallacher, was convicted of aggravated arson. The assistant fire chief, a man named Jim Duncan, said the fire was already out of control by the time they found it. A firewall was all that kept it from taking the whole complex. The one serious injury was to a firefighter named Steve Smith, whose career ended when a hose broke loose in his hands. It is a genuinely dramatic ending, and it has nothing to do with Peterborough. That fire was in Peru, Illinois. It burned the parent plant, the American original, the works that had closed back in 1980, the ruin that the internet remembers, the gutted landmark, the arson, the teenagers, the flames on New Year's Day. All of it belongs to the other Westclox, the one across the border. Somebody, somewhere, decided that was too good a picture not to use, and the fire got quietly transplanted north, onto a factory it never touched. So let's set the record straight, because the truth is stranger and gentler than the legend. The Westclox factory in Peterborough did not burn. It was not gutted. It was not abandoned to the boreal winter to be pulled apart by frost and birch saplings. It is, right now, one of the most alive buildings in East City. After the clock stopped, the building was renovated and given a new name: Times Square. Today it holds something like 210 apartments and about 70,000 square feet of offices, on Hunter Street East, up on the hill above the lift lock, exactly where Werner raised it in 1922. People live behind those brick walls now. They wake up there, most of them surely, to a phone rather than a bell. In 2020, the city approved plans for a further development of roughly 250 apartments on the land nearby, a cluster of new buildings looking down over the same canal. They mean to call it Lock 21. The ground remembers the clocks in one darker way. In 2019, monitors found a plume of trichloroethylene in the earth beneath the site, the ghost of the degreasing chemicals a clock factory once used to clean its parts. And it sits now under the watch of the province's Environment Ministry. The building woke up. The soil is still holding its breath. As for the name on the clock, it went where the making went. When General Time finally shut down its worldwide operations in June of 2001, the Westclox trademark was sold off, along with the Big Ben and Baby Ben names, for $9.8 million. It changed hands again a few years later, and the clocks that carry those names today are made in China. You can still buy a Big Ben. It is a fine clock. It has almost nothing to do with the one your grandmother wound on the hill in Peterborough. The town, for its part, absorbed the loss the way it had learned to. Westclox was not the first factory Peterborough buried, and it would not be the last. Outboard Marine went, and in 2018, after 126 years, Canadian General Electric, the giant in the valley, the anchor of the whole electric city, made its last product and closed its manufacturing for good. The town that had made clocks and motors and turbines turned, as so many did, toward the things that don't close. The hospital, now the largest employer in the city, the university, the college, the tourists who come to watch the great hydraulic lift lock raise boats into the sky. And the boxes went to the museum. The seniority lists, the payroll sheets, the company magazines, the softball photographs. All of it now sits in the Peterborough Museum and Archives, and in the Canadian Clock Museum up the highway, and in the archives that hold the old Examiner. The factory that made time is now, itself, a thing kept carefully in the past tense. Chapter 11. What remains? So, was it one mistake? That was the story we started with. The proud company, the fatal blunder, the clean line from the top of the hill to the bottom. We said we'd hold it to the light. Now we have, and it doesn't hold. There was no single arrogant refusal, no one executive who looked at the future and turned his back on it. Westclox helped put quartz on the way to the moon. The company knew exactly what was coming. What it could not do, what no clever decision in Peterborough could ever have done, was change the arithmetic. A high-wage plant in an old building, behind a tariff wall that was falling, owned by a distant conglomerate that cared about airbags and missiles, making a mechanical product the world was walking away from. Every one of those things was decided somewhere else. The town held the tools. It never held the key. That's the harder truth, and it's the one that leveled the Swiss and the Americans too. Not stupidity, not one bad call. A whole structure, quietly coming apart. The branch plant bargain collected, the tariff wall pulled down, the work following the cheaper hands. A beautiful mechanical thing made obsolete by a crystal the size of a grain of rice. The alarm clock is still there, though. That's the strange grace of it. Somewhere in this country, on a shelf or in a drawer or at the back of a cupboard, there is a Big Ben with Peterborough stamped inside it, still keeping time, or ready to if you'd only wind it. It was built by a woman on a hill who walked up through the snow in the dark, who fitted its parts by hand under a lamp in a room kept at a careful, permanent spring, who tested it and boxed it and sent it out to wake a stranger she would never meet. The building she worked in is still up there, above the lift lock. The lights are on. People are sleeping behind those walls tonight, and in the morning, most of them, something will wake them. Though not a bell, and not a thing made in this town, and not a clock anyone had to wind. The ticking is gone from the hill. What's left is the quiet, and the brick, and the water moving through the lock below the way it always has, carrying boats now instead of clocks, up toward the light.